When and how did humans leave Africa? It's traditionally been thought that modern humans left Africa relatively recently, maybe around 50,000 or 60,000 years ago, walking out of Egypt through the Sinai Desert. But increasingly, evidence suggests a very different scenario, that we may have left Africa much earlier and via a southern route into the Arabian Peninsula with a sea crossing. This is the story of what may have been the First Odyssey. So humans evolved, we originated in Africa. Our closest relatives today, the chimpanzees and gorillas, still live there, along with baboons and old world monkeys. There's a high diversity of primates there, including human-like primates, the great apes. And this led Charles Darwin to propose in his book, The Descent of Man, that humans originally appeared in Africa. And as often happens, Darwin managed to get it right while having very, very little evidence to work with. He was, I don't know if he was an intuitive thinker, a very rigorous thinker, but he was a very good thinker. And he was able to figure out that we probably came from Africa. And in the 100 years after Darwin wrote, the fossil evidence has emerged, vindicating him, showing that the first hominins, that is, members of our lineage, appeared in Africa. And we have early primitive hominins in Africa, followed by a succession of increasingly advanced species. So we have early primitive forms like Ardipithecus, then Australopithecus, then Homo erectus, and finally primitive members of our species, Homo sapiens. We also see increasingly advanced tools appear in Africa. Several million years ago, we start seeing the first crude choppers and chipstone flakes, then Acheulean hand axes, and finally more complex tools like level wall points and arrowheads appear in Africa. So we're seeing the rise of technology in Africa. Until around 50,000 years ago, Africa is the epicenter of human technological development. And today, human genetic diversity is highest in Africa. Now, I could talk about things like heterozygosity and mitochondrial haplotypes, but it's kind of easier, more intuitive, and more obvious to just look at faces. And these days, the concept of race has kind of fallen out of favor. But keeping that in mind, there isn't really any such thing as a black race. There's not just like one group of people we call black or African. There were historically 5 or 6 genetically distinct lineages in Africa, and they share a few things like dark brown or black skin and black hair, but there's incredible variation in the facial structure, in the body shapes, and in the genetic diversity of people in Africa. And this diversity, the incredible diversity of African people, implies a very long history, a long period during which we evolved and built up genetic diversity there, followed by migration to the rest of the world, to the Middle East, to Europe, Asia, Australia, and the Americas. We weren't actually the first humans to leave Africa, however, the first hominins out of Africa. Modern Homo sapiens are one of multiple waves of migration out of Africa that took place over millions of years. And these migration events would give rise to multiple species. Species like Homo floresiensis in Indonesia, Homo georgicus in the Caucasus, Homo erectus in Indonesia again, Homo antecessor in Europe. A later migration will produce 2 distinct species, the Neanderthals in Europe and the Middle East, and the Denisovans in Asia. And curiously, it seems like we weren't even the first Homo sapiens to leave Africa. Around 200,000 years ago, there was a primitive lineage, a primitive subspecies of Homo sapiens, not modern humans, but archaic Homo sapiens. And they migrate into the Middle East and Europe. And they're represented by the Shkul and Kasfa people in Israel, and by the Apodema skull in Greece, and by Grotte Mandra in France. And they are sometimes called anatomically modern Homo sapiens. I think that's kind of overstating the case a bit because they have a number of really archaic features. They've got great big brow ridges like Neanderthals and big jaws and long brain cases. So I think it might be easier to describe these guys as nearly modern Homo sapiens, or I sometimes call them archaic Homo sapiens. And they're probably a side lineage, a side branch, not part of the main lineage, main line of Homo sapiens evolution. And rather than giving rise to modern non-African peoples, They are a separate dispersal event out of Africa that fails. They're wiped out by Neanderthals around 60,000 years ago. So there is this other earlier out of Africa migration that doesn't give rise to the main out of Africa migration we're interested in talking about, the one I'm talking about here today, which is the one that gives rise to us. So in total, the fossils suggest something like 6 waves of hominin dispersal out of Africa. The precise number is unclear. It depends on how you draw the evolutionary tree. We keep finding new human species we didn't know about before. But the important thing here is that there's lots of different waves of migration, one after another, and possibly others that remain undiscovered. And our lineage, modern humans, are just the last and most successful. The final wave of migration out of Africa, we're the lineage that wiped out all the others that came before us. So we've seen that modern humans would, or rather, hominins would repeatedly leave Africa. Then how many times did modern humans, modern Homo sapiens, leave? And somewhat surprisingly, given that we have evidence of multiple waves of migration of these other human species and other lineages, a number of different lines of evidence suggest that all modern non-African people arise from a single migration event out of Africa. There is one out of Africa migration that gives rise to modern non-African peoples. So how do we know this? Why do we think this? Well, there's a number of different lines of evidence that point in this direction. It's a fairly well-supported hypothesis. So first of all non-African peoples appear to be more closely related to each other than to African people. So they represent a single branch of the evolutionary tree. They include Europeans, Middle Easterners, Asians, Australians, and American Indians. And nested within this group, North Africans, people like Egyptians and Berbers, are closely related to Middle Easterners. They're kind of a back into Africa migration. But basically, all these non-African groups are closely related. There's a single origin of non-African humans, non-African modern Homo sapiens, which implies a single migration event out of Africa. That's the simplest explanation that fits the distribution of these people and their evolutionary tree. Second, this group, the out of Africa peoples, the non-Africans, have fairly low genetic diversity. Well, why is that important? What it implies is a genetic bottleneck, that this group descends from a relatively small founder population that, because it was relatively small, brought a limited sample of genetic diversity that was present in Africa tens of thousands of years ago. Now, think about a small colonizing expedition arriving on an island. It will tend to be a bit inbred. You have a handful of people giving rise to everyone else on that island, so you end up with fairly low genetic diversity, and people are fairly similar. Most of the people in Iceland, for example, are pale-skinned and blonde-haired and blue-eyed, for example. And that's because Iceland was settled by a relatively small group of Vikings, maybe about 10,000 people or so. So there's not a huge amount of genetic diversity there. It's an island settled by a small island colonization event. And in much the same way, the underlying genetic diversity of non-Africans is relatively low. And it's been estimated that the founding population that gave rise to all the non-Africans may have been something on the order of 1,000 or 1,500 people, which is about the size of a single large hunter-gatherer tribe. So one tribe or a couple of small tribes could have given rise to all non-African people that are alive today. Another really interesting line of evidence supporting this idea of a single out of Africa migration is evidence from linguistics. And we can, in the same way we build evolutionary trees using genes, we can build evolutionary trees using memes and look at how languages evolve. One language gives rise to multiple languages, creating an evolutionary tree of languages, just like for species. And we can reconstruct language evolution. And curiously, attempts have been made to reconstruct the language tree for all human languages. And this produces this really interesting result, which is that non-African languages all appear to be closely related. So languages like English and French and Russian and Chinese, Tibetan, Hebrew, Mongolian, Navajo, Aleut, Maori, Tasmanian, they all descend from a single language that evolved over time into many different languages. And this evolutionary tree, we have this tree leading to all the non-African languages that is nested inside a tree of African languages. And a curious thing about this grouping of non-African languages is that the click sounds that we see in hunter-gatherer languages like Bushman tongues and other African tongues is completely absent. So it seems that soon before or after these people left Africa, they stopped using these click sounds in their language. So again, this pattern we're seeing, not just in the genetics, but in linguistics, supports the idea of a single founder population, a single tribe where everyone speaks the same language, giving rise to all the people and all the languages that we see outside of Africa, which is pretty amazing when you think about it. All these tribes, all these people, all this genetic diversity, all these languages coming from a single original founder population of maybe just 1,000 or a couple thousand people. So one more curious piece of evidence, and this is kind of a really interesting piece of evidence, supporting this out of Africa scenario, is that the non-African peoples that we see in Europe and Asia, Australia, the New World, all share a feature, which is that they have small amounts of Neanderthal DNA. About 1% of our DNA in our genomes is Neanderthal rather than modern human. And this implies a scenario in which this small founder population, soon after they left Africa, they encountered Neanderthals, they intermarried, we had kids together. These kids were brought up in the human-dominated tribes, and we pick up a small percent of our genes from the Neanderthals. So all non-Africans share this small amount of Neanderthal DNA because we all descend from that ancestral tribe that intermarried with the Neanderthals. So again, we have several different lines of evidence: genetics, linguistics, Neanderthal DNA, consistent with a scenario in which there's a single small group of people leaving Africa and giving rise to everyone else. So how did this happen? How did we leave Africa? And the answer to this question, it's a big debate. It's one of the biggest debates in human evolution. I'm going to present an idea. I wouldn't say it's necessarily the mainstream or most accepted idea, but it's a really interesting idea, and I think it's the idea that the evidence points toward. And it suggests a rather, well, a very interesting scenario. To tell this story, we need to go back to the origins of Homo sapiens. Where do we come from? So based on modern human genetics, based on molecular clock models, we believe that modern humans lived 300,000 years ago, give or take a few tens of thousands of years either way. So how do we get at this estimate? Well, we arrive at this. We don't actually have any archaeological evidence or fossil evidence to support this. This is based on what is known as a molecular clock. And what we do is we compare gene sequences of different populations. We see how different they are. And we say, okay, modeling the rate of evolution, how quickly we think mutations build up, how much time would it take for these various descendant populations to diverge from an ancestral population, and working backwards from that, from knowing the rate of evolution, how long ago did these populations split? And depending on which analysis you look at, modern humans might have emerged anywhere from a relatively recent, in evolutionary terms, 200,000 years ago to perhaps somewhere around 260,000 to 350,000 years ago, again, depending on which analysis you look at. So these, there are a number of different estimates you can come up with based on different assumptions, but using various different assumptions, several 100,000 years ago, the ancestor of all modern humans lived somewhere in Africa. We can also look at this evolutionary tree and we find this really interesting pattern where the deepest splits are the ones that lead to southern lineages. So the first population split off from everybody else, 200, 300,000 years ago are the Bushmen. Something like maybe 50 or 100,000 years after that, the Pygmies split off, then West Africans, then East Africans. And finally, one branch splits off, leading to non-Africans relatively recently, depending on various analyses, maybe around 75,000 to 100,000 years ago, depending on which of these models you look at. So this tends to imply, if you kind of try to map the evolutionary tree onto Africa, the ancestral population is probably located somewhere in southern Africa, maybe northern South Africa, Botswana, Zambia, then spreads throughout Africa into East Africa, and then one group leaves Africa. This tribe that leaves Africa will be the ancestors of all non-African peoples. That includes Australian Aborigines, Papuans, Andamanese, Indians, American Indians, Chinese, Polynesians, Arabs, Greeks, Romans, Russians, French, Celts, Scots, Belgians, and so forth. What do we call these people? I guess we could call them the out of Africa people. I don't really have a catchier name for them than that. But what we've seen is that their low genetic diversity and language diversity compared to Africans suggests they left Africa relatively recently in a single wave. Exactly when and how they left Africa is a topic of great debate in human evolution. So traditionally, it was thought the out of Africa migration was a relatively recent event. And this is based on archaeological evidence and evidence from bones that humans become widespread in Eurasia relatively recently. So around 40,000, 50,000 years ago, we start to see modern Homo sapiens appearing in Eastern Europe about 50,000 years ago. They spread into Western Europe and displaced Neanderthals by about 40,000 years ago. And at about the same time in Eastern Asia, in China and Japan, we start seeing humans show up about 40,000 years ago. So this sudden spread of humans into Europe and into Eastern Asia seemed to be consistent with a relatively recent migration of Africa about 50, 60,000 years ago, and then this rapid spread that wipes out your Neanderthals and Denisovans and Homo erectus in the process. So the simplest way to leave Africa, the simplest way the out of Africa people could have gotten out of Africa was to cross the Sahara from sub-Saharan Africa, moving up the Green Nile Valley. You have water available there from the river. You have game drawn to the water. So you have food, you have water. You have this very habitable corridor going through more hostile desert terrain. From the Nile Delta, one can then go east overland from Egypt into the Sinai, then into the Levant, and then north into Mesopotamia. And in ancient times, armies would march along this same route between Egypt and the Middle East. This is how Alexander's forces got to Egypt. It was called the Via Maris, or the Sea Road. And you would march from Israel and Jerusalem through the Sinai and then into Egypt. So the simplest explanation for how we left Africa is that people walked out 50 or 60,000 years ago via Egypt and the Sinai into Israel, taking the Via Maris. Now, as often happens in science, as all too often happens in science, the simplest explanation that fits the facts is usually the correct one. But as often happens in science, the simplest explanation stops working as you get more and more facts. So as we've gotten more facts about human evolution and human migration, the simple explanation doesn't fit the facts anymore. This is the simple explanation, and I would argue that it doesn't work. And we start needing to look for a more complex explanation of when and how humans left Africa. So if humans did leave Africa using an overland route relatively recently, what we'd expect to see is that modern humans, modern Homo sapiens, would appear first in Egypt around 50, 60,000 years ago, then in the Sinai and Israel. But this is not the case. What we see is we have fossils in the Levant, in the Middle East, that show that this area is first occupied not by modern humans, but by primitive near-modern sapiens, the Shkul and Kazfa people. These are these archaic humans, the big brow ridges and the weird skull shapes, around 100,000 years ago. And the next people that show up after these guys, these archaic Homo sapiens, are not modern Homo sapiens, but Neanderthals, appear around 60,000 years ago. And they invade and they retake the lands. They were displaced from this area, and then Neanderthals moved back in and displaced these people. So 60,000 years ago, we don't see modern humans moving in. We see Neanderthals moving in. And in fact, the oldest modern Homo sapiens we see in Israel, these are people without the big brow ridges, a more modern globular rounded brain shape, date to just 55,000 years ago. And this is surprisingly recent in light of some finds from elsewhere in the world. The problem is that we have humans appearing in Israel 55,000 years ago, and then astonishingly, we have traces of modern humans appearing long before this in Southeast Asia and as far away as Australia. So here, for example, in Northern Australia, in Arnhem Land, we see signs of human habitation. We see groundstone axes, we see grindstones, we see ochre pigment dating to 65,000 years ago. That's 10,000 years before we see people appear in the Levant. How is that possible? There's clearly something very strange going on here. And it's not just that Australia doesn't fit this pattern. It's like everything we're finding in Southeast Asia seems to contradict this pattern of people appearing first in Israel and later in the rest of the world. So in Sumatra, for example, we have fossils of modern humans dating to somewhere between 63,000 and 73,000 years ago. So we have an even bigger time gap here than we do with Australia. So we have people appearing much, much earlier in Southeast Asia, in Indonesia. In Laos, we have fossils of modern Homo sapiens dating to 77,000 years ago. Again, that's almost 20,000 years earlier than we're seeing people in Israel. In China, we have modern human teeth from a cave dating to over 80,000 years ago. And we have tools in India suggesting humans are there about 80,000 years ago. So again, we're seeing all this evidence in Asia and Australia of humans there much earlier than we're seeing them in the Holy Land in the Levant. How is that possible? What exactly are we missing here? We also have other evidence in the form of rock art. In Sulawesi in Indonesia, we have rock art depicting this pig that dates back to 51,000 years ago. We have hand stencils dating to 68,000 years ago. So we have a number of different lines of evidence. We have teeth and tools and rock art, and they're all suggesting this very early present in Southeast Asia and Australia before we're seeing modern humans in Israel or North Africa. Now, I could see one or two of these sites being incorrectly dated, but they're all wrong. It defies belief to think that they're all wrong in the same way. And again, this all looks pretty modern. The bones look modern, the teeth look modern, the rock art, Neanderthals never made rock art this complicated as far as we know. The tools we're seeing, groundstone axes, are only made by Homo sapiens, modern Homo sapiens. We don't see them made by Neanderthals or Denisovans or even by archaic Homo sapiens. So this looks very modern, and yet it's very early and it's very, very far away from the Middle East. And people have tried to argue that to kind of save this idea of this relatively late emergence out of Africa, they've tried to argue that these people we're seeing in Southeast Asia and Australia are part of an early failed wave of migration. And for me, that just kind of stretches credulity. Like, it just doesn't make sense. And the reason why is it would require that all these people that we're seeing in Southeast Asia, in Indonesia, in Australia, they all went extinct, left no living relatives. And not only that, they didn't interbreed with any later peoples. They left no genetic signature. So you have to have this huge migration. And we're seeing all this evidence from bones and stones and art, and they're just completely disappeared basically and leave no trace in modern cultures. And that just doesn't make sense to me. That's not what we see. Elsewhere, when we see people move in, we see that they interbreed with the locals. And the fact that implies to me that this is probably not what's going on here. So another data point is North Africa. For humans to be moving out of Africa relatively recently using the northern route, we should see evidence of this, archaeological and fossil evidence of this, in North Africa and in Egypt, and we don't. We have modern humans appearing in Egypt only around 33,000 years ago. This is the Nazlet Khader site, the skeleton Nazlet Khader II, and modern humans wouldn't reach Morocco until around 20,000 years ago. And what's more is the bones that we're finding, the bones of these people don't look like out of Africa people. They look like sub-Saharan Africans. So there's not even any good evidence that they're part of the out of Africa migration. They seem to represent a separate group of people that moves up the Nile later. And what's really interesting about this is this was first proposed on the basis of the skulls. They say, yeah, these skulls, they look African. And part of me is like, yeah, can you really tell that? Can you really tell it looks African versus non-African based on the skull? Well, we've later gotten some genetic data. We found some more recent remains of people in North Africa, these ancient North Africans, and they do in fact appear to represent a sub-Saharan African group. They're not out of Africa people, but they're closely related to them. So the genetic data actually supports this idea that there is a migration into North Africa that is related to but distinct from the out of Africa people, and they're appearing there relatively late. So we're getting this pattern that's just completely backwards from what we should be seeing. We should see people first appear, modern people should first show up in Egypt, then in Israel, and last they show up in Southeast Asia and Australia, the furthest away. And instead what we're seeing is that they're first appearing in the East, and then the Middle East, and then in Africa. This is completely backwards. What the heck is going on here? The key here may lie in some rocks and fossils from the Arabian Peninsula. So stone tools have been identified in the Arabian Peninsula dating to around 125,000 years ago. And these are interpreted as not looking like other Middle Eastern archaeological assemblages, but instead resembling what they call the African Middle Stone Age. There's what they call these foliate bifacial tools and small hand axes and level waw points and things like that look like an African assemblage, and it's suddenly showing up 125,000 years ago in the Arabian Peninsula. And what this suggests is an early migration and a distinct route out of Africa, an early southern route out of Africa through the Arabian Peninsula, rather than through Egypt and Israel. More recently, we've also found a finger bone from the Nefud Desert of Saudi Arabia from a human dating to 88,000 years ago. This is so far the only skeletal evidence for an earlier southern migration of humans into Arabia. And this seems like a lot to hang everything on, right? A finger bone, really? I'm a paleontologist. I work on some very fragmentary remains, and even I look at this and I'm like, really? A finger bone? Is that it? But the trick is, it turns out if you really study skeletal remains in detail, there's a phenomenal amount of evidence in every single bone. Like, you give me a toe bone, and I can tell you that's a tyrannosaur, that's a dromaeosaur, that's a troodon, or whatever. Just one dinosaur toe bone is all I need to tell you what family it is, and you can often go further than that. Well, human paleoanthropologists spend a huge amount of time looking at bones, and we have a big modern sample. They get very, very good discriminating these things. And it turns out that almost every single bone in the body, you can tell if it's Homo sapiens or Neanderthal. Even beyond that, individual bones like finger bones, limb bones of modern Homo sapiens are distinct from those of archaic Homo sapiens, like the Skull and Kazfa people. And if you take this bone and you do a bunch of measurements and you throw it into a multivariate analysis and kind of plot out where it plots in shape space, what you find is this finger bone plots within the range of variation that we see in modern Homo sapiens. So it's just one bone, but it seems to fit the idea that there are modern humans in Saudi Arabia almost 90,000 years ago, consistent with an early migration out of Africa via the Arabian Peninsula. So taken all together, the evidence suggests that modern humans skipped North Africa. They skipped Israel and the Levant. They skipped that route entirely. Instead, we may have taken a southern route from Eastern Africa to Arabia, to the Arabian Peninsula. Then we rapidly moved along the southern coast of Asia, along the Indian Ocean, into India, Southeast Asia, and finally into Australia. And only later did humans move overland westward into the Levant, and then finally invade North Africa from the east. And North Africans, like Berbers and later Arabs, will represent an into Africa dispersal of the out of Africa people that happens in the Neolithic after the invention of farming. So that's what the evidence now seems to be suggesting. Now, what's the genetic data show? Interpreting genetic data is complicated, and there's no real consensus about what the genetic data shows, but at least some of the genetic evidence is consistent with an early coastal migration out of Africa. So one thing we find is a high diversity of mutations in mitochondrial DNA. And mitochondrial DNA traces maternal descent, that is descent through the mother's lineage. And we see a high diversity of mitochondria in the Arabian Peninsula and South Central Asia compared to the Levant. And that implies that humans have been here for a really long time, building up diversity. There's a lot of mutations there, a lot of different types of mitochondria because we've been there a really long time. And that's the place we've probably spent more time outside of Africa than anywhere else. So here we have some genetic data, at least, that supports this early southern route out of Africa. It turns out that at least some molecular clock models are consistent with an early out of Africa migration. They date the out of Africa split, a split between Africans and non-Africans, to, in some cases, around 75,000 years ago in one model. In a different model, using a different set of assumptions, they get a split of up to 115,000 years ago. So give or take a few thousand years. These things come with error bars around the estimated date. But at least some of these molecular clock models are able to be reconciled with a relatively early migration out of Africa. Now, in isolation, I would argue that no single piece of evidence is decisive here one way or the other. Not the stone tools, not the bones, not the genes, certainly not any site in isolation. I wouldn't say just looking at the Australian site in Arnhem Land that solves everything. That we can say, yes, it was definitely a late northern route or an early southern route out of Africa. But what I'd argue is that when you look at a lot of different lines of evidence together, it's remarkable how they tend to converge on a relatively early dispersal out of Africa using a southern route. And so we have evidence from Australia, but also evidence from Southeast Asia and Indonesia. We have the fossil evidence from Egypt and Israel as well, consistent with this relatively early migration. At least some of the genetic data is suggesting a migration via Saudi Arabia, the high diversity of mitochondria, for example, and at least some of the molecular clock studies are consistent with this. And it's this congruence that I find striking. And the correct hypothesis, whatever happened, it only happened one way. But the human migration out of Africa would have left evidence of its passing in many different lines of evidence. It would have left bones, they would have left tools, they would have left cave paintings, they would have left genomes in ancient skeletons and in modern people. So the correct hypothesis, the true scenario, is going to be supported by many different lines of evidence, not by a single line of evidence. So I find it often in the case of a scientific debate, you're a lot better off trying to triangulate between multiple different lines of evidence and look where they converge. Even if those individual pieces are tentative, what story do they all tell together? Whereas trying to put everything on a single analysis, no matter how complex and sophisticated that analysis might be, is much more likely to mislead you and maybe have some really super complex computer model that says this is what happened. And that in isolation looks very compelling, but then if you have lots of different lines of evidence that point in another direction, I think that's often going to be more accurate. And so I think when you try to resolve these debates, you want to look at as many different lines of evidence as humanly possible. And I think they converge towards this early southern route out of Africa. And at least that's my take on the evidence. Now, there are some molecular models suggesting a more recent origin. And again, I think you kind of have to look at everything. So there is, for example, a recent study trying to look at the human Neanderthal hybridization event and say, when did this happen? And they have argued that this human Neanderthal hybridization event occurred around 40 to 50,000 years ago. Now, if this is correct, because all non-African peoples descend from this hybridization event, if this is correct, then we must have migrated relatively recently and become widespread outside of Africa after this migration event. So that would strongly favor a relatively recent origin. A lot of people put a huge amount of faith in this study. But there are other studies that give very different results. There is another study looking at the genetics of people in Papua New Guinea and Australia. And what they argue is the genetic data is consistent with these people arriving in Australia and Papua New Guinea around 60,000 years ago, which is long before this other study's estimate of the Neanderthal human hybridization event. And these people they have Neanderthal DNA. So they are descendants of the hybridization event, but they're arriving in Australia, 60,000 years ago. Both of these studies can't be right. One of them has to be wrong. I mean, maybe they're both wrong for that matter. That's always another possibility you have to consider. But it tells you that these studies can't be taken as decisive. No single study settles the debate. And again, I think what you have to do is look at the congruence or consilience between multiple different lines of evidence, different studies. The map is not the territory. Just because somebody has a really complex model of genetic evolution, a really complex molecular clock model, well, lots of people come up with lots of different models and lots of different studies, and they don't all agree with each other. They can't all be right. And so I don't think any single study can again, no single study could prove this scenario or disprove this scenario. You have to look at everything. And I would argue that even taking some of these studies that appear to contradict this scenario into account, the bulk of the evidence points towards this relatively early southern route out of Africa. Now, if this is the case, and humans took this early southern route out of Africa to the Arabian Peninsula, how did they get there? And this is really a remarkable story. So a key piece of the puzzle. So the Arabian Peninsula is separated from Africa by the Red Sea, separated by ocean. And it's a relatively wide stretch of water. But a key piece of the puzzle is that sea levels change over time, and so coastlines and water barriers change over time. And sea levels were much lower in the last ice age because, well, it's the ice age. There's all this water locked up in ice. And so you have huge ice sheets extending across Europe and in Patagonia and across North America. At times, the ice sheet across North America is several miles deep across most of Canada, from British Columbia to Newfoundland, is under ice. And that's ice that isn't going into the oceans. The sea levels drop by at times 50 meters or even 100 meters or more. And so the coastlines go way out in places. And this would have dramatically changed the landscape between Africa and the Arabian Peninsula. So the Red Sea is too deep to completely dry up when the sea levels dropped. But the edges of the Red Sea are quite shallow. And so when the sea levels drop, the coastlines go way out and the Red Sea becomes much, much narrower. And this means that it was possible potentially to cross the Red Sea from Africa into the Arabian Peninsula, a Red Sea crossing. Where you might be wondering, have I heard this idea before? The idea that humans left Africa and went into the Arabian Peninsula across the Red Sea. Well, this is in one of my most famous stories in human history in the Bible, in the story of Exodus. This is how Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt across the Red Sea. In this scenario, the Red Sea doesn't completely part, but it narrows a lot. And I mean, if this scenario is true, it's a surprising degree of just kind of resonates with something in the Bible, which is interesting when you think about it. Maybe it's just a coincidence. I don't know. Or is God trying to send us archaeologists and paleontologists a bit of a hint here? Maybe he's messing with us. Maybe he has a bit of a sense of humor. But it's kind of interesting that we have this myth of a Red Sea crossing, and we have archaeological evidence that seems to point towards the idea that humans did, in fact, leave Africa via the Red Sea. So the Red Sea is narrowest at Bab-el-Mandab. This is the Gate of Tears. And this is where the Red Sea enters the Indian Ocean. And as the sea levels dropped, at times it would have been just a few kilometers across. And there are a couple of points here where it would have been relatively easy to make a water crossing. So one of these is Bab-el-Mandab itself. It gets very, very narrow there. There is another narrow point just kind of the north and west of that at the Hanish Islands. And this could also serve as a crossing point. We don't have any good reason to prefer one or the other. But these are the two most likely places to cross the Red Sea if you were going to make a water crossing out of Africa. It would have been so narrow here that you could have easily stood on African soil and looked across, and you could have just wondered what was on the other side. You didn't have to use your imagination and say, hey, maybe there's something out there. You'd have stood on the beach here in Africa, looked across, and you would have seen outside of Africa, and you would have seen the land over there. You would have realized maybe there's food there, there's water there, maybe there's other people, maybe there's, you know, you didn't have to imagine, you could just sit there and see it. And the distance was short enough that it was probably possible to simply swim across. If you were a good swimmer, you could probably, swim straight across and reach the other side, then swim back. And maybe some people actually did that early on. So could people have simply swum across this water barrier out of Africa and into the Arabian Peninsula? Probably not. And the reason why is that these people would have moved as a tribe, or perhaps several small tribes. Let's say a tribe of 1,000 people are in Africa and they decide to move over to the other side. And you can't just all swim because they had kids. They would have had their children, they had toddlers, they had infants who couldn't swim. And these people would no more have abandoned their children than we'd abandon our children to go move somewhere else. You bring your children with you everywhere. So even if they could have themselves swum, they had to find some way to get their kids across. And to do that means that for this tribe to make the migration across the Red Sea, they must have had some kind of watercraft. Maybe not something very complex. It only had to go a couple of miles, but they still had to have some way to float people across this distance and make a sea crossing to bring an entire tribe across, maybe many small crossings, but they had to be able to cross water and bring people across using some sort of watercraft. Now, we have very little in the way of archaeological evidence for ancient watercraft. In the area, we have very little archaeological evidence for ancient watercraft in general because they're made from wood, they rot. And we can't really infer a lot about how people might have, crossed water by looking in the area today. Because what we do see people use boats in East Africa today, but they're using fairly advanced technology. They're using outrigger canoes that are of Indonesian design, but not brought by the Malagasy. They're using dhows. These are clearly recent innovations imported into Africa, and they're not telling us a lot about what people may have had in Africa 100,000 years ago. If we want to understand primitive watercraft, I think what we need to do is look at hunter-gatherers living in similar conditions elsewhere in the world. And the people who provide the best insight into how early people may have exploited water and moved long distances over water are going to be the Australian Aborigines in Australia, people in Papua New Guinea, and people in Tasmania. So these are hunter-gatherers and tribal farmers. And these people had to get there by boat. So even during the last ice age, when the sea levels fell quite a bit, Australia and New Guinea were isolated by water, by 50 or 60 miles of open ocean. So when people arrived in New Guinea and Australia, they arrived there by boat. These were boat people. They were people migrating across the sea. Once they arrived in Australia, humans would exist there in near isolation for 60 or 70,000 years. And because they had relatively little exchange with the rest of the world, their technological additions are going to be relatively conservative, and they probably provide a better glimpse into the kinds of technology people have used long ago in Africa than we can really get anywhere else in the world. So, and again, what I would argue is that if we look at other parts of the world, they're using much more advanced watercraft. In places like Indonesia and Polynesia, they're using outrigger canoes and sophisticated dugouts and boats with sails. And the North Pacific, they're using skin boats. And these are very sophisticated watercraft. And I think they're very unlikely to reflect the types of watercraft that people would have been using 100,000 years ago. Instead, I think Australia gives us our best insight into how people might have been exploiting coastal environments and moving over water in Africa thousands of years ago. So the Australian Aborigines make a wide variety of boats and watercraft. One of the types of watercraft they make are rafts. And these aren't simply rafts that just drift passively, but you can like a paddleboard or like a whitewater river raft, you can paddle them around. You can use them with a pole, kind of pull them along in shallow water. You can use a paddle made out of wood or bark. You can paddle them using your hands. And they're made in a number of different ways, and what they're made out of depends on, and how they're made depends on the local materials. Sometimes they're made by bundling and lashing reeds together. Others, like this raft, for example, this raft from Australia, is made by pinning mangrove trunks together to create a platform. And in other cases, they would layer bark together to create simple rafts. The Australians would also make much more sophisticated craft. These are not simple rafts. These are bark canoes. They're boats. And these bark canoes are made by cutting long strips of bark off of trees using an axe. Then you shape it into a boat. They would often use fire or steam to heat the wood and bend it. And they would bend it into this boat shape. And these boats have several advantages over a simple raft. They have this very long, narrow, streamlined shape that allows them to cut through the water, so they can travel relatively quickly compared to a raft, which has a lot more drag. They have a hollow hull. The vessel is literally a vessel. It's a hollow, watertight container, and this displaces water to create a buoyant force. And so this has a number of advantages over a raft. So for one, for a given amount of material, a hollow hull can carry a lot more people and cargo than a simple raft. So it displaces a lot of water, and all that water displaces, giving you a buoyant force that holds people and cargo, and so on and so forth. Rafts don't carry nearly as much as a boat will. Another advantage to a boat over a simple raft is that the people and cargo are sitting below the water line. And so that provides a lot more stability, especially in rough conditions. So it's much less likely to tip over than a raft. You're standing up on the raft or sitting on the raft, it's much more likely to tip. And then just the shape being more hydrodynamic, it requires a lot less energy to transport as cargo. You can reach higher speeds. You can travel longer distances before you run out of food or water or get tired. So all of this makes displacement hulls the best, if not only, option for long sea journeys. And we don't know whether they would have used something like this to get out of Africa, which is a relatively short journey, but quite likely something like this would have been needed to colonize Australia and Papua New Guinea, because these are distances of 40, 50, 60 miles that they're crossing over water. They would have needed a fairly sophisticated watercraft, we think. We also see in Tasmania, they would make these crude canoes by tying bark together or tying reeds together. And then another thing we kind of need to talk about but this is complicated, is dugout canoes. Could people have been using dugout canoes? And this is one of the oldest and simplest forms of watercraft, but it's really unclear how far back they go. So some people argue that the use of dugout canoes in Australia and Papua New Guinea is that they're a relatively recent technology that's imported from Asia, and that they probably didn't make these early on and may not have had the technology needed to make these early on. But this is debated. We do see some evidence. The key technology needed to make a dugout is a good axe. And we see evidence of ground stone axes in these early sites in Australia, which would have been needed to make dugouts. So maybe they did use dugouts early on. And the fact that they're not more widespread in other parts of Australia is just that people stopped making them. We don't really know. So we don't really know how far back things like dugouts go. But there's something, I don't know, there's this kind of weird contradiction here, because on the one hand, people have argued that sophisticated watercraft like dugouts and bark canoes might be relatively recent. We also know that these people are colonizing Australia, making these sea journeys of 40 to 60 miles 65,000 years ago. And it's been argued that rafts wouldn't be appropriate for this. So one of these two things is wrong. Either they were able to use simple rafts to make these long ocean crossings, or sophisticated watercraft go back much further than we think. Either way, they were able to make some fairly long ocean crossings a long time ago. If we go a bit further away into Southeast Asia, we see other types of watercraft. We see bamboo rafts in Indonesia, and we see palm rafts in India. So what we see is, especially in Australia and Papua New Guinea and Tasmania, a remarkable diversity of watercraft using a variety of different techniques, different building techniques, different materials. and that hunter-gatherers could build watercraft and navigate them and use them effectively to cross long distances, to go fishing and foraging. And this is going back, again, this is going back tens of thousands of years ago, that they were colonizing these areas by maybe 65,000 years ago or earlier. So if you look at the evidence, what you see is really remarkable, because to get to Australia, you can't just make one crossing. You have to make a whole series of crossings. So the colonization of Australia, Papua New Guinea, and Southeast Asia is not the story of one very ambitious voyage. It's a whole series of ocean crossings. So that, again, the sea levels are lower, but there's still a lot of deep ocean channels there that you had to cross. And so we see evidence of multiple long distance ocean crossings through Indonesia into these various islands, into Australia and Papua New Guinea, with dates on these islands, archaeological remains going back tens of thousands of years. And then we start seeing people in the Solomon Islands and so on and so forth. So we're seeing sophisticated ocean journeys going back tens of thousands of years, 70, 80,000 years ago in Southeast Asia. And this is remarkable when you think about it in context. People are widespread in Indonesia, Australia, and Papua New Guinea, and making these long ocean journeys 60, 70,000 years ago, while the rest of us were fighting Neanderthals in Europe. Even before this is long before we were fighting Neanderthals 40,000 years ago. So what's my argument here? Well, my argument is that if people were capable of making these long open ocean sea journeys 65 or 70,000 years ago, it's not crazy to think that tens of thousands of years before that, they could have been making much shorter sea journeys and making the sea journey out of Africa into the Arabian Peninsula, crossing Bab-el-Mandab and the Red Sea. So I'm not arguing that the precise designs used in Australia and Papua New Guinea are the same ones they were using in Africa. These people came tens of thousands of years later. Their technology was evolving. They're taking advantage of local materials. But what I'm arguing is that these are some of the simplest known watercraft. They suggest an ancient history of seafaring, and they give us some idea of what tools and technologies would have been available tens of thousands of years ago to cross the Red Sea 100,000 years ago. I think to actually understand what technology people might have used, we need to think in terms of the context. So what tools do they have available? What materials do they have available? What's the environment like? So first of all, there's no evidence that these people had sophisticated groundstone axes. In fact, they had hand axes. Even if they had axes, there aren't a lot of trees along the coast of Djibouti and Eritrea. So there's not a lot to make canoes out of, or bark canoes or dugout canoes out of in the first place. I guess there probably would have been baobabs, but baobabs are kind of the opposite problem. They're just kind of too big to cut down for boats. The Malagasy will make them into canoes, into outrigger canoes, but I don't think making baobabs would be very feasible. So I think some sort of bark canoe or dugout might not be practical given the technology and the available materials. We do have some evidence of reed boats in Africa. These are used in interior areas where you have papyrus reeds growing, but you don't have a lot of reed marshes on the coast of Eritrea or Yemen where it's very dry. And it's thought that these reed boats are a technological import from Egypt, from the Egyptians. So they're probably not going back 100,000 years ago, people making reed boats. So what do we have there? And given the technology of the day, which would have been hand axes or simple hafted axes, what could they have made and how would they have made it? And I think the most likely explanation is just some sort of simple raft. And mangrove trees, we saw that Australian mangrove trees grow all over the place there. And as we saw, the Australians would make mangroves into rafts. We also have palm trees. So these are the most likely materials. A simple raft made out of mangrove or palm wood. And they're not going very far. They're only going a few miles. You could make that crossing probably in it'd be a long afternoon maybe, but you could make that crossing in a day using a simple raft, using the technology available at the time, using the available materials. Throw your kids on a raft and kind of, take everybody across the side, go find some new fishing territory. All this raises a question, though. If people did, in fact, make the sea crossing out of Africa, why would they do this? Why would they not just take the seemingly straightforward route up the Nile and out of the Sinai? Well, the answer may be that this route was blocked. It just wasn't very easy to go that way. I mean, it's not like this was uninhabited land. We know that at this time, archaic Homo sapiens, these are relatives of the Shkul and Kasfit people, lived in Egypt. And so you would have had to basically fight these people as you're moving up the Nile. You're going through their territory. They might not be very happy about that and might not let you through. So that way may have been blocked. And even if people had managed to break out of North Africa into the Sinai and the Levant, they may have found Neanderthals throughout much of the Middle East. So these areas were occupied. And rather than being, a highly accessible highway, the Nile Valley in the entrance to Sinai may have been highly defended choke points, preventing people from moving out of Africa using this route. Meanwhile, we have the shoreline of the Arabian Peninsula, and it may have been much harder to defend. And some stretches of the far shore may have had relatively few people or no people at all. So it may simply have been just easier to go that way because it wasn't as heavily defended as the other route out of Africa. So according to this scenario, once humans become established in the Arabian Peninsula around 100,000 years ago, Homo sapiens would then rapidly spread down the coast, probably with the assistance of watercraft, skirting Neanderthal inhabited lands and then moving into India, moving into Southeast Asia, and finally moving into Australia. And watercraft and associated technology may have given humans an edge in this migration. If humans had boats, for example, they may have been able to launch supply raids from the sea, kind of like Vikings in medieval times. And so the sea goes from this defensive moat to a vulnerable route of attack if you have some sort of boat or watercraft. Alternately, they may have simply avoided fighting. If people had boats, they could have simply skirted well-defended territories. They could have established themselves in more poorly defended territory on beachheads, or they could have used uninhabited islets and beaches, sort of like the island hopping strategy used in the Pacific in World War II. Now, the primitive nature of early watercraft, simple rafts or bark canoes, probably limited their effectiveness. But if the people they're facing off against didn't have any sort of watercraft at all, they would have provided a massive tactical and strategic advantage as they're migrating along the coast here. And this may help explain why people first move along the coast is because they're using boats. And obviously moving through the deserts of the Middle East, boats are a lot less helpful. So that might help explain why we got to Australia long before we get into most of the Middle East. Another key advantage here would have been the ability to exploit the sea. So if these people are exploiting, coastal resources, marine resources, tools like rafts, fishing spears, fish traps, and so on would have let them exploit these marine resources. Things like fish and shellfish, spiny lobsters, shrimp, sea turtles, dugongs, dolphins, and so forth. And the first people out of Africa may have been fishermen. And if that's true, the sea would have provided this rich source of protein, which they would have had relatively little competition for. That would have allowed their populations to grow faster and sustain larger numbers than by living just off of the land alone. And this again may have given them a big edge in territorial conflicts with Neanderthals and Denisovans and Homo erectus, and allowed them to move quite quickly along the coastal route into Southeast Asia. So this all sounds quite speculative, and it is pretty speculative because this often happens in archaeology. We just don't have the evidence we need to test our hypotheses as much as we'd like. But we have found some evidence that seems to support this scenario. So along the coast of Eritrea, about 125,000 years ago, we find traces of tools that are being used in marine environments on a beach deposit, and they're found in association with marine resources like oysters and crabs. So people are living along a shoreline. They appear to be exploiting marine resources. And what's really interesting is this tool tradition that we're seeing in Eritrea looks remarkably similar to the one we're seeing in the Arabian Peninsula. They use a very similar suite of tools. So we have here one of the earliest records of humans using marine resources. And this is exactly what we would expect if people were using boats or rafts 100,000 years ago. If they were marine migrants, if they were making ocean crossings, they were probably some sea people or coastal people making use of marine resources. And we're seeing people in this area precisely where we think the migration would have happened, and they're using marine resources. So if these people are exploiting coastal resources, they are quite likely swimming to islands, making simple rafts, and they may have, as they started foraging, they just would have kind of swam offshore, taken a raft offshore, and tried to find better fishing grounds. And at the time, they might have not looked across the Red Sea and said, "Oh, wow, that's another continent." They just would have seen, "Hey, there's a beach over there. I wonder if there's some good lobsters and sea turtles to eat over there." And they just would have taken an afternoon and gone over there and gone fishing for the day. So the first migration out of Africa may simply have begun as a fishing trip. And then somebody said, "Hey, this is a great place. We should spend more time here." So it may simply have been these are early fisher people, and they were in search of new fishing grounds, and that's how they found the route out of Africa. And again, if we want to understand what this culture might have looked like, the Australian Aborigines and Tasmanians may provide our best insight into what an early coastal people would have looked like. And we tend to think of the Australian Aborigines as a desert people, hunting kangaroos in the outback with boomerangs. And that describes some of the tribes, yeah. But historically, most of the people didn't live in the desert. They lived along the coast. They lived along the waterways. They exploited fish and shellfish. And they've been doing this for tens of thousands of years. The Australian Aborigines are primarily a coastal people, of which some tribes later moved into the desert areas. And they have a pretty diverse set of fishing techniques. Aboriginal fishing technology includes hand-thrown fish spears and simple dip nets. They make stone fish traps, which would funnel or trap fish as the tide receded. They would weave fish traps out of cane and other materials, similar to modern crab pots and lobster traps. They do make fish hooks out of shell. These are found in northern Australia, but the archaeological records suggest they're a relatively late invention and probably imported into Australia, not part of an ancient toolkit. But what we're seeing is that the hunter-gatherers are just ingenious in exploiting marine resources. And even if it's the case that early hunter-gatherers didn't have some of the more sophisticated tools, they might not have had fish hooks, they might not have had fishing nets. Well, they probably didn't really need them either, because without modern fisheries and fishermen exploiting them, the fish just would have been a lot more abundant. So there just would have been really good fishing because it just wasn't being exploited. So you probably could have gotten by with something simple like a fish spear rather than, really sophisticated seine nets or whatever. So direct evidence to test these ideas is unfortunately scarce, as is often the case in archaeology and paleontology. And there's a number of reasons for this. One reason is the seas were a lot lower at the time. If humans did cross the Red Sea and then spread along the coast all the way to Australia, they were doing this tens of thousands of years ago during the Ice Age when the sea levels were a lot lower. The sea levels have come up, and most of the traces of these early migrants and these early migrations is going to lie under 200 to 300 feet of water, buried under corals and sands and muds. So a lot of the evidence, if they were migrating along the sea coast, is under the sea right now. Another problem is that a lot of the technology they used is just not going to preserve. We like to talk about the Pleistocene as the Stone Age, but in fact, most of the tools that Stone Age hunter-gatherers use, people like Bushmen, American Indians, Aleuts, Aborigines, most of their technology is made of non-stone biodegradable materials. They make tools out of wood and bark and roots and leaves and grass and animal skins, and all these things rot. And it's the same as obviously going to be true of early fishing gear and early boats. So if, for example, the early out-of-Africa migrants are using wooden rafts and bark paddles and wooden fishing spears, almost none of this is going to preserve. The only thing that would preserve is going to be a small stone tip of your fishing spear. And even then, your archaeologists are going to struggle to understand its purpose. So that's a very frustrating thing about this hypothesis. I appreciate this might sound like special pleading, Like, well, why isn't there more evidence of this? Well, it's all under the ocean. Very convenient, isn't it? But it's also exactly what you would predict. So, and hey, it's not like there's a lot more evidence for a later northern route out of Africa either. There's not much evidence for this hypothesis, but I'd say there's more evidence for it than there is for the alternative, which is not saying a lot, I concede. So this leaves us with another question. As we've discussed, there is this sudden appearance of modern humans in Israel, in Europe, in Eastern Asia, starting around 50 to 40,000 years ago. What's up with that? If that's not the out of Africa migration, what is that? Where are all these people coming from? And why do they take so long to show up? So what I think is probably going on here is as people are moving along the coast, as they're moving along the coast of the Arabian Peninsula, and then ultimately going to Southeast Asia and Australia, some people kept going east and other people stayed and just kind of stayed where they were. And they may have been hanging out a bit south of a bit to the south of the Levant. There's kind of a refugium there. They're kind of holed out and they're hemmed in by the Neanderthals to the north, and they suddenly break out. So where is this place where people are holed up, this refugium, and they're kind of pinned in by the Neanderthals? And why don't we have any archaeological or fossil evidence of it? So part of it would have been the Arabian Peninsula, but I think one of the areas where people may have been concentrated is what is now the Persian Gulf, because again, the sea levels are much lower. At the time, the Persian Gulf, which is very shallow today, that was dry land. And through the middle of that would be running the Tigris-Euphrates river system. So the Persian Gulf, that's completely dry land, and you have this huge river running through the middle of it. You're going to have wetlands, you may have oases, marshes, things like that. And this would have been able to support a large number of people. There would have been water, there would have been game, there would have been food, and people have been hanging out there for tens of thousands of years until the sea levels come up around 12,000 years ago. So people may have lived alongside these rivers and oases, hunting and fishing for thousands and thousands of years. And then suddenly they break out around 50, 60,000 years ago and then begin to expand throughout the Middle East and Europe and Asia. Why did they take so long to suddenly break out? And I think the answer may lie in a sudden technological revolution, because a new technology shows up at this point. Can you guess what it is? It's the bow and arrow. The first time we see arrows outside of Africa is in Eastern Europe. As people start moving into Europe, they're bringing arrows with them. And the bow and arrow may have given them the ability to take on Neanderthals and Denisovans in a way they really couldn't before. Because the bow and arrow, it has less stopping power than a spear, but it's got much greater accuracy. So you can barely hit someone with a spear more than about 60 feet away. Beyond that distance, it's very, very hard to hit anyone with a spear. But the effective range of an arrow is about 100 feet with a bow. So you can stand outside a spear range and just hit people with arrows. And this may have finally broken the stalemate between Homo sapiens and the Neanderthals and Denisovans. And once these people, who are holed up maybe in southern Mesopotamia, the Persian Gulf region, Arabian Peninsula, once they get the bow and arrow, it's all over for the Neanderthals and Denisovans. So it looks like the out of Africa migration, what we thought was the out of Africa migration, the sudden spread of people into Europe and into Eastern Asia, is in fact a spread of people out of the Arabian Peninsula and the Persian Gulf region following the acquisition of bows and arrows. Following this, we will see more sea crossings. We will see people reach Japan around 40,000 years ago. Hunter-gatherers will colonize Japan. We'll also see people colonize the Americas. So the first people into the Americas are tundra hunters, and they simply walked across the tundra of the Bering Land Bridge around 30,000 years ago, and this is the origin of most of the American Indians. However, around 12,000 years ago, the ice ages end, the sea rises, the Bering Sea forms. And what this means is that later immigrants had to come by sea. And around 10,000 years ago, a tribe of boat people will cross the Bering Sea using skin boats. And these people, the archaeologists call them Paleo-Eskimo, but the modern descendants of these people are the Tlingit Indians, the Copper Knife Indians, the Navajo, and the Apache. And then more recently, we see another migration, And this is the Eskimo-Aleut migration around 3000 BC, which is in Europe, this would be the Bronze Age. So we have two ocean migrations bringing people into the New World. And then remarkably, we see a major migration around 10,000 years ago with the spread of farming into Europe and across the Mediterranean. So it appears the spread of farming in the late Stone Age and the Neolithic is driven by travel over the sea. It's coming by boat. The Neolithic Revolution is coming by sea. What's really remarkable is if you look at this map, the Neolithic farmers, the first place they show up is in the Peloponnesian Peninsula, the very southernmost part of Greece. You don't see any farmers up to the north or off to the east as you might expect if they're coming overland from the Fertile Crescent. Instead, you find them in the very southernmost tip of Europe. And they spread up north a bit, and then they start appearing in coastal areas in Italy and Sicily and France and Spain. And again, you're not finding them anywhere in between. You're just popping up the coast. How is this possible? Well, the way this is happening is the farmers are coming by boat. They're coming by sea. And here's another map, and what you can see is that we initially, before people show up in Europe, they're appearing in Cyprus and Crete. And these people are migrating out of the Fertile Crescent, the northern Fertile Crescent in Anatolia, what is now Turkey, and they're moving into the Mediterranean Ocean by boat, and then they're colonizing Europe and the Mediterranean. The roots of civilization, agriculture, is being spread by sea. And these people they're not closely related to most modern Europeans, Northern Europeans. So unlike modern Northern Europeans, like the Irish and Germans and Scandinavians, who are quite light-skinned, these were a browner-skinned, more dark-haired people. And so we still see traces of their genes in the Mediterranean regions in Southern Europe. And the darker complexion and darker hair you see in modern Greeks, Italians, especially Sardinians, that comes from these ancient sea people who are coming from the Fertile Crescent in the headwaters of Mesopotamia. So we see, genetic traces of this ancient sea migration that brought farming to Europe. We also see some interesting cultural relics of this ancient Stone Age migration of sea people. So if we look at modern Greek culture, the Greek language it's an Indo-European language. And it's descended from a language spoken by the Yamnaya, by these plains herders who rode in from the Russo-Ukrainian steppes and conquered everybody, and they brought their language. And that's the origin of Greek and Latin, most European languages. What's curious is that there's this Yamnaya language, the Indo-European language, which is modern Greek, but it has elements that just don't quite fit, that it has words in Greek that don't sound like other Indo-European languages. Where are they coming from? So we have some unusual sounds, like there's a double S sound, like Parnassus and Knossos. And these are not typical Indo-European sounds. They're words from the sea peoples that the Indo-Europeans conquered. Another word, thalassa, the double S again. Thalassa is Greek for sea, but it's not. It's an ancient word that comes from these early sea people, and it's kind of relic of their culture that's preserved into the ancient Greek and then modern Greek. So the word for sea is an Indo-European. The sound, labyrinthos. That's labyrinth is a non-Indo-European language. It's coming from these ancient languages brought by these Neolithic sea people. Another kind of relic of these kind of very ancient cultures, I suspect, is probably Greek mythology. Think of the way that the sea is so present in Greek mythology. We have sea monsters like Scylla and Charybdis, sea gods like Poseidon, the sirens. Aphrodite is born of the sea foam. This is not the myth of plains herding people. This is not the mythology of Russo-Ukrainian steppe herders. These are the myths of ancient sea cultures. How far back do they go? Thousands and thousands of years. Odysseus, the name Odysseus, the double S again. That is a very ancient word, and it's foreign to it's foreign to the Greek language. And the story of Odysseus, again, the story of a sailor trying to return home and getting shipwrecked and lost along the way. This is not the story of the mythology of a sea people. How far back does this go? And it's doubtless changed a lot over the millennia. It's probably gained pieces and added pieces and stitched together from many different stories and edited heavily over thousands of years has passed on. So I wouldn't argue that something like the Odyssey goes back 10,000 years, but I think that it's entirely possible that elements of the Odyssey, the story of being lost at sea, of shipwrecks and storms and foreign lands full of strange people and monsters, could be very ancient. And it seems like the type of story that you might tell to your kids if you were an ancient seafaring people in the Neolithic period 10,000 years ago spreading across the Mediterranean. So just how ancient is the Odyssey? I suspect, maybe elements of the story go back thousands and thousands of years, these Stone Age farmers spreading out of the Fertile Crescent. So the Odyssey has sometimes been called the foundational myth of Western civilization. There may be something to that. Elements of the Odyssey may be a relic of this ancient sea migration that first brought farming to Europe. So this idea that farming is spread heavily by travel by sea and by water, it seems to be a general phenomenon, or at least a widespread phenomenon in the sense if you look at the spread of farming in Eastern Asia, we see a fairly similar pattern. We see a lot of early adoption of farming along the coasts, along rivers. Farmers are spreading by boat. And then in 2500 BC, thousands of years ago, we start seeing, we have a really amazing colonization event, the colonization of the Pacific by the Polynesians. And over thousands of years, Polynesian outrigger canoes will sail from Taiwan to Melanesia, Fiji, Rarotonga, New Zealand, Tahiti, Hawaii, Easter Island. And then in 1200 AD, 300 years before Columbus, the Polynesians actually managed to discover South America, which is just extraordinary to think about. And if you've ever been out to the South Pacific and seen the extraordinary distances these people traveled, it's just amazing to think about how they did this just using Stone Age technology. The sea is incredibly important for understanding human history. Ask yourself, why did technology advance so far, so quickly in the West? Why did Europe become dominant, not China, the Aztecs, or the Inca? And I think the answer may be the sea and the unique role that it plays in the evolution of Western Europe's culture and technology. The Mediterranean has sometimes been called the Mediterranean Lake. It's relatively calm, it's enclosed by land on all sides, so it doesn't build up huge waves during storms the way the Atlantic and the Pacific do. That makes it a lot easier to navigate. It's warm, but it doesn't have huge stretches of warm tropical water, so it can't sustain hurricanes. And hurricanes can't travel over lands. They need warm seas to drive the storms, so it's protected from hurricanes. The Mediterranean is unique among the world's oceans in not having hurricanes. You'll see for example, in Mexico that the Maya never got into seafaring or coastal cities in a big way. And in large part, that's because hurricanes rip through frequently destroy them. One of the few exceptions is the coastal city of Tulum, and it's the exception that proves the rule. It's built up on a cliff where it's protected from hurricanes. And another issue is prevailing winds. You'll see in the Gulf, for example, we have these strong trade winds that drive onshore. And if you're trying to sail offshore, it kind of makes things very difficult. In the Mediterranean, you don't really have these strong prevailing winds. You have lighter winds, they change seasonally. So it's easier to row or sail about the Mediterranean than it is in other places where you have really strong winds. And then the Mediterranean has all these little islands and harbors, places to seek shelter in a storm, places set in for water or food on a longer voyage. We have, in the ancient world, we have ports like Piraeus and Athens and Syracuse, Ephesus, Istanbul, Alexandria, little islands like Crete and Malta, Sicily and Sardinia where you can stop off to break up a long trip. And there are other places you have islands like Indonesia, and you do get a lot of sailing there, but you don't have the same number of islands in a place like off the coast of China or off the coast of Peru or off the coast of Mexico. Another thing is that like certain areas just don't have any good harbors. The Gulf Coast of Mexico is very shallow and it doesn't have a lot of good harbors as a result. And there's not a lot of good harbors along the Pacific coast of Mexico and South America. Africa has almost no good harbors. The Mediterranean is full of harbors. That makes it a great place to be a seafaring people. The Mediterranean is also a relatively warm sea. So if you get shipwrecked there, you're likely to survive. I grew up in Alaska, and you'd last in the cold North Pacific about 30 minutes before you would die of hypothermia if your boat went down and you didn't have a survival suit. And when I was growing up, people would die every year when the crab boats would go down in the Bering Sea. The Mediterranean Sea is a much more forgiving place to be a sailor. Odysseus, for example, survives a shipwreck. An historical example, a remarkable story is that, Paul the Apostle, one of, Jesus's disciples, is put on trial by the Romans. And so transporting him to Rome for a trial, his ship wrecks, but they manage to swim to shore. Paul is famous for his conversion on the road to Damascus, and he's one of the most important figures in the spread of Christianity. But you can imagine that if Paul had shipwrecked in the cold North Atlantic, he wouldn't have made it to shore. And so history might have gone very, very differently if he hadn't survived that shipwreck. And the fact that people were able to survive shipwrecks, it was just a much more forgiving environment to learn to be a sailor, for people to travel. And this made the transfer of people and ideas much easier in the Mediterranean than it did in other parts of the world. The Mediterranean is just a great place for seafaring technology to develop. So you have key technologies like plank boats and oared galleys and sails, lateen sails, later multi-masted vessels appearing here. And we start seeing some truly ambitious sea voyages. In ancient Greek times, some Greeks would sail as far away as the British Isles, the North Sea. One of the most astonishing stories is that Herodotus, writing in 2500 BC, claimed that the Phoenicians sailed south of the Red Sea and circumnavigated Africa, returning through the Straits of Gibraltar. The idea that the southern end of Africa was surrounded by water wasn't mere speculation. They put this on the maps because they knew people had done it. And this seems incredible, and it's easy to dismiss a lot of Herodotus's myths and lies and half-truths and gibberish. And so this would be very, very easy to dismiss, this idea of the circumnavigation of Africa, except for one small detail. A detail so incredible that Herodotus himself was skeptical of it. The Phoenicians claim that eventually they got so far south, they sailed south around Africa, that at noon, the sun would pass them in the north. And Herodotus is like, yeah, I don't know. That sounds pretty fantastic, even for me. But it's this detail, they got below the equator, that suggests the Phoenicians did in fact manage to sail all the way around Africa thousands of years ago. And all this sea travel, well, this creates trade and migration and colonization and wars, raiding expeditions like the Trojan War and naval wars like the First Punic War. And these exchange ideas. And so what we see in the West is a fusion of ideas from all these diverse cultures, from Europe and from the Middle East and from Egypt. The Egyptians give us the alphabet. The Greeks give us philosophy and math and science, democracy, myths like the Odyssey. The Lydians create the first coins and create coinage. The Romans give us a legal system and a highly organized government with constitutional separation of powers. The Jews and the early Christians give us an ethical code and the foundations of modern morality. And then we get Arabic numbers, and via the Red Sea trade routes, we get an Indian numbering system and the compass from China. And all these different ideas, technologies, cultures, ideas, myths, religion, ways of doing things. The ancient Mediterranean sees incredible technological innovation and cultural innovation, and it's feeding off the diversity of all these people who are exchanging ideas by sea. At least until the Romans kind of take over the Mediterranean, create something of a monoculture, and technology kind of stagnates. But then Rome collapses, things fragment again, and we have diverse cultures in the Mediterranean and beyond, the Atlantic, Italy, England, France, Spain, Portugal, exchanging ideas and technology, and the sea is a major vector of all this. And then eventually we have Europeans developing highly sophisticated sailing vessels and exploring the world. And finally, we will link the people of the out of Africa diaspora. The Portuguese will sail south around Africa and rediscover our ancestral homeland in southern Africa. Columbus will discover the New World and the Native Americans. And Captain Cook will meet with the descendants of Australian and Polynesian seafarers. The people of the out of Africa migration are brought back into contact. What's astonishing to think about is that all of these odysseys may have begun with a single short voyage. And that voyage started with someone standing with their feet in the warm sand on the shores of Africa, looking out over the water and wondering what lay on the far side. And all the other explorers, all their discoveries, all their shipwrecks, all those odysseys are the result of that first dream, the First Odyssey.